Hello, thank you so much. And thank you for all of you sitting there listening to the translations. I know that's very tiring. Thank you for your patience. This is, I'm pretty certain, a unique historical moment here at this third conference. I'm very, very glad to witness it, to be witness to it. I worked with lots of NGOs and community groups, consumer groups around the world in relation to local food and the localization of the economy. But I have to say, I haven't met many local governments with holistic vision as we are seeing here in Jeonju. And I have also recently had the chance to visit the Barron Shire and experience what's happening there. So the fact that these two local governments are here together is amazing, and I think and I hope that you will be leading the way, both of you, for other local governments to follow in this visionary footpath for a future that works for people and planet. I'm here, I'm going to talk about local food. I will speak a little bit about the global food system first, but I'll try to make it quick because I know we're short of time. So the global food system, we've already heard a bit about the global economy, but it is a product of the global economy. And the one thing to keep in mind is that it's a corporatized food system. So increasingly corporations are controlling the inputs into farming, from the seeds to the chemical fertilizers, and the output, the sale, and even the production. And it is a system that is extractive and destructive, both in an environmental, social, and economically. And very important to highlight is that the industrialized large-scale production goes hand in hand with centralized retailing. So today a study was made that shows that only 10 corporations own the majority of the industrialized foods that we see from Asia to the Americas, in Europe, and so forth. So if we want a different agriculture, we also need a different retail system, and vice versa. And all of this is, of course, a product of the global economy, which we heard earlier is a process based on perpetual economic growth, which means it's not enough just to be wealthy, or it's not enough to produce what we're producing now, but to keep on in producing. So the only thing, when I talk to my students, I say, can you imagine something that has infinite continuous growth? The only thing that does that are cancer cells. And that is a symbol of the economy that we have now. A phantom economy, a debt-based economy, that doesn't really represent anything real in the world. So, I often hear that sort of where we're at now is an evolutionary process, or that it's something that's so big that we can't change. And of course that feels incredibly disempowering, but it is a product of fairly simple mechanisms of regulations, taxes and subsidies, that we are here to talk about how we can change some of those in favor of the localizations that we are looking for. And Raymond Epp, that gave us started this session with a video clip, was talking about free trade treaties. And I just want to mention that very briefly, because the free trade treaties is perhaps, I call it like the acupuncture pressure point. If we want to change something, we need to change these treaties, because they are the ones that are enabling the big corporations to roam the world. And outcompete local businesses because they have favorable conditions. And all of these new free trade treaties, as you probably know, have something called Investment State Dispute Settlements, ISDS, which allows corporations basically to sue governments when governments do something they don't like. For example, Vattenfall, which sadly to say is a Swedish energy giant, sued Germany when Germany decided to phase out nuclear energy after Fukushima. And that is unresolved. There are so many cases of this, so this is one of the things that are keeping governments hostage in many countries. So the situation we have, generally speaking, is one where the small businesses, the local businesses, are over-regulated in many countries and paying quite a lot of tax, whereas the big ones are deregulated and have all sorts of ways of not paying any tax. So their success, you could say, which I mentioned yesterday, have more to do with what we call corporate welfare than efficiency of scale. Unfair systems. And what we are seeing, in short, is a race to the bottom with these free trade treaties. So how do the companies compete? They compete mostly on jobless growth, so there are no more jobs coming out of it, but on pressing salaries, on moving to places with low environmental standards, and then other countries that want their new corporations to come in to provide more jobs have to lower their standards or offer them tax extension and so forth. So the only ones that are winning in these games are the transnational corporations, not people, not planet, and not government either. We're losing democracy. So I thought it was in its place to mention some of the subsidies to the big business, so we can do away with that myth of efficiency of scale. In many parts of the world, I don't know what the situation is here in South Korea, there are huge, huge subsidies to the large-scale industrialized agriculture. So, for example, in the US, 75% of these subsidies goes to the largest 10% of business, 256 billion between 1995 and 2012. In EU, 90% goes to the largest 10%. A decade ago, I did a study of agricultural subsidies in the EU, and I found that only 0.9% were going to organic farming. So, of course, it's not a surprise when industrial products are cheaper, because they are subsidized. Fossil fuel industries, while we talk about climate change and Paris agreements, nobody, or very few, talk about the fossil fuel industries being subsidized. So 5.3 trillion in subsidies to fossil fuel businesses around the world in 1 year. Now that's probably quite conservative. That comes from the IMF, what I wanted to say here, that during the Paris Agreement, this was not talked about once. We're also subsidizing global infrastructure for long-distance transport. And 36 trillion between 1995 and 2013. We're talking about big ports, big airports, long-distance highways, and so forth. Most of this is paid for by government, i.e. by taxpayers. Imagine if we just used a fraction of that money to build up infrastructure for our own businesses. And something that is also happening as part of the so-called free trade package is land grabbing. So this is a new form of colonization in a new shape. In just 2 years between 2008 and 2010, 16 million hectares of fertile farmland were leased or sold to foreign investors for large-scale agriculture projects, and 50% of that is happening in Africa. So I've been watching a little bit of television here in Korea, not that I understand anything, but I did see UNICEF had quite a number of ads asking for help for people in Africa. And a lot of that might be as a result of catastrophe, corruption and so forth. But we have to remember that a lot of that also has to do with people's inability to produce food for themselves. And the land grabbing in very much part of that, of fertile land being transferred from producing for local needs to be producing for export crops and industrial crops. So here we see 4 crops that have taken over, quadrupled over the past 50 years. 150 million hectares of fields and forest have been taken over by these crops. Most of them are owned by big corporations. The 4 crops are soybeans, rapeseed, sugarcane and oil palm. So the first 3 ones, they're not used for food. They are used for so-called biofuels, which are not as green as they sound because they are being produced with lots of chemical fertilizer that is fossil fuel dependent and so forth. Oil palm is used in almost every single product we can think of today. And this kind of corporate rule that we are seeing, and the focus on producing for distant markets before producing for our own needs, are leading to absolutely ridiculous situations of the same kinds of foods being imported and exported between countries because food has become just a commodity, something to make money on. And another thing we can see here is that with the increase in exports of goods, not just agricultural goods, we have a parallel increase in global CO2 emissions. They go hand in hand. So if you want to solve the problem with climate change, we need to look at that and on the fossil fuel subsidies, amongst other things. We also have to remember this is the global waste and pollution problem is very much part of this system, and the global food system has a big part to play. 300 million tons of plastic a year, 2/3 of which are being used for throwaway packaging, for example, of food, coming from one end or the other. And we have also seen an extinction of species before and after the Industrial Revolution, but very much on the increase in the last 100 years. What we're also seeing, as you probably also know here, is a growing resistance worldwide to the corporate control, to the free trade treaties, both on a national level and on a regional level, as Simon was just talking about how they've been standing up to these big energy giants that have been trying to move in. And I think what we need now is to step up and make that resistance international, work together across frontiers also towards an economy of happiness for people and planet. So we need to turn around against the big fish. And I wanted to mention, I'm going to be shifting into local foods now, an organization that is worth knowing about called La Via Campesina, which is a peasant movement, the biggest one in the world. They got 200 million farmers that are part of that, small farmers and peasants from around the world, started in Latin America. And it defends sustainable small-scale agriculture, and it has been the single, perhaps biggest movement that have been standing up to industrial agriculture and transnational corporations. They're worth looking out for and collaborating with. And so, shifting direction is something that we have been talking about for many years, and finally we are seeing a lot of people around the world waking up to that. And we see it as a systemic alternative to globalization that has so many different benefits at the same time, so that's why we call it a solution multiplier. Within that localization movement, what I have seen is that the local food initiatives and the movement within that is sort of leading the way for other initiatives as well. Local food is definitely at the heart of our localization process because it can bring people together, consumers, producers. Food means something to everybody. And it has such a fantastic multiplier effect. For example, it is easier to shift to organic, it brings in more jobs, stronger economies, and it does a lot of the things we need to do if we're going to tackle climate change, of reducing the dependence on fossil fuels in many different ways. So what we've seen in particular is easier to shift to organic production when you are supplying a local market. If you're tied in with centralized retailers, it can be very, very difficult to shift production. A lot lower energy use in organic agriculture. I'm sure it differs from different parts of the world, but this is from the UK, where we see 30 to 50% less fossil fuel energy is used there than in industrial agriculture. And there's sort of some differences there between crops: wheat, potatoes, carrots, onions, and broccoli. Of course, when you localize and you close the circuit in terms of money, if you shop in an independent business, it roughly generates 3.5 times as much wealth within your local economy compared to if you spent the same amount of money in, for example, a centralized retailer, where the money will be invested elsewhere. It will leave your community, probably to build up more stores elsewhere, and to benefit the distant shareholders. A study that was made in UK a few years ago showed that when you buy directly from farmers, as happens at a farmer's market, the money circulates 10 times longer within the local community, creating many other jobs and strengthening the local economy. And more jobs. Another UK study looked at what happens when a new supermarket comes in. And they found the average net loss of jobs is 272 in the UK. Now, what we always hear when new retailers come in, at least that's my experience, is that they will bring in more jobs. And that may be true initially, but after a few years, local shops will close and we will have a net loss of jobs. When we localize agriculture, we also get the benefit of greater diversity. Not just in production, but also in the gastronomy that we have also been witnessing here. The range of local foods that you have and you haven't lost. But that's not the same in so many other countries. In Mexico, we are also fighting against the big transnational chains that are trying to erode Mexican culture and food economies. It's very important also as local governments, I think, to recognize the key role of small and medium farmers, both in maintaining diversity. They're the ones that are keeping the seeds. About 75% of the seeds worldwide, food crops, are held by small farmers. Also, small diverse farms have also been shown to be far more productive than monocultural farms, and they are also the ones that are our intellectual knowledge banks that have the experience that can keep food production going under very adverse conditions as well. So about 70% of food, of the food that we consume worldwide is actually being produced by small farmers. So I'm going to talk about some different local food models we already heard about farmers markets, and they are spreading all over the world. I just want to mention this one from Costa Rica, Feria Verde. They host, was started by a group of young people, and within just 3 years, I think they got 2 farmers markets started in the capital of San Jose. They have 3,000 weekly consumers. 500 families make their main income from the market. Now that's very unusual. A lot of farmers markets, it's only an additional income. Here it's the main income. They created a participatory local certification scheme. All of the food that they produce there is organic or in transition. And for me, the most encouraging thing about this was that, and the measure of success, is that for the first time, the sons and daughters of the aging producers want to go into agriculture. Because this is also a new way of selling food. There's direct contact with the consumers. It's almost like a fair, a cultural fair every single week. They have a relationship with the people that they sell their food to. There's a different status to farming. So I think that it's really something to learn from. And they, yeah. So another model is food assemblies. They're also spreading in Europe. It's you pre-order the food online. There's a platform online where you order the food, and the farmer only comes to the weekly market if they've had enough orders to make it worthwhile financially. You could say the sort of they do have to pay a percentage of their income to the software provider, but I think one could easily copy that and do away with that model. Another thing that we talked about yesterday a bit was the community-supported agriculture. That is also spreading. Box schemes and community gardens. The community-supported agriculture is when consumers subscribe to a specific producer and share the risks and the benefits as well. And I wanted to give you an example of this in fishing. Now this skipper Otto from Vancouver in Canada has sold his fish directly, or they sell their fish directly to consumers that are subscribing. So those people pay a fixed price a year. Every single week during the fishing season, they get a share of what they have fished sustainably. And in Denmark, we have something similar, but again, it's a bit bigger. It's a network. You go in online, you can see, you look up on a map in your region, and you can see who are out fishing. And then you can, if you sign up, you can get a message saying, fisherman so-and-so are going to arrive in half an hour at that port and is bringing this kind of fish, and you go down to the harbour and you buy it directly without any middleman. And that is also working quite well. Another thing that's taken off in many parts are the consumer cooperatives. I'll mention Denmark here, where the Copenhagen Food Co-op has 3,000 members. They buy directly from a multitude of small local producers so that they can get a bit of everything. And this was actually inspired by the Japanese Saikatsu Club and others in Japan that are on the forefront of this. Now the Copenhagen Food Co-op also created some software that can make it easier for these food co-ops to keep track of everything. And it has spread to other parts of Denmark, and now 21 food co-ops in Denmark, all buying from local producers. Another thing that's happening, which is community stores that buy local food and sell local food. This one is from Exeter in the UK. It's owned by 300 people. that live in Exeter, and 99% of the food that they sell come from the region. 70% comes from locally. Most of it is organic. They have a bakery, they have a shop, they have a cafe, they do cooking classes and arrange for producers to come and meet with the consumers. So it's much more than just a place where they sell food. Cargemania is also an interesting example. It's from Hungary. They deliver local food, organic food, directly to consumers, but they do it by bike. That's their transport. And they collaborate with a bike manufacturing company, or cooperative, a bike delivery company, an organic vegetable farm, and an organic bakery. So it's 4 businesses that are working together. Totally Locally was started in the UK, and it's an organization that has created materials that make it easier for local community, for businesses to get together, for consumers to get together, to strengthen the local economy. It's not just about food, but they have some very interesting materials that I would recommend that you look at. So they have these town kits that tell people about how they can get organized, how they can educate consumers on buying locally, how they can convince local retailers to buy from each other and local services providers rather than going to big companies from the outside. It's being used all over the world, and it's free. Another thing that's helped, I feel, the local food economies are local business alliances, and the best known probably is the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies from the US, and they help local shops to unite forces against the big transnational companies that are trying to move in on their turf. And they do things like, when you don't have an enlightened local government, they try to educate local governments on the benefits of local businesses, why they should be supporting the local businesses and not giving free land and tax extensions and so forth to businesses from the outside. A very interesting model here from the US is the Slow Money Network. I don't know if you've heard about that. It's specifically designed to invest in local food. So it's a network that brings in philanthropists and people that have a bit of money. So instead of putting all your money in the bank, why don't you lend some money at a low interest to people, to entrepreneurs, to producers that want to create a healthy local food system, but they can't get a loan. And this has spread. They have invested $57 million in 632 local and organic food enterprises between 2010 and 2017. And this is spreading around the US. Another thing that in some countries we have are sort of, you could say, conventional banks, but ethical banks. So there is an international alliance of ethical banks. It's called the Global Alliance on Banking on Values, and there are both in Asia, in America, and so forth. Some of them have, what they have in common is that they don't just think about profit, they think about people, they think about planet, they don't invest in dirty business, neither fossil fuels, nor arms, nor anything like that. They invest in organic agriculture, in community houses, in things for the common good. And these are 2 banks, Ekobanken in Sweden and Merkurbanken in Denmark. A lot of those are also cooperative banks. So just to finalize, what we, within the organization that I come from, Local Futures, recommend for an economics of happiness is a multitude of actions. Resisting corporate globalization, we feel, is very important. It has to be done at the same time as we renew locally, which is what we're talking about here. To do that, we need to connect with others. We can't do it on our own, so we have to connect and change the I to a we. We need to educate ourselves and others. That is an action. It's not a passive thing. Because in most countries now, the media is closed to the kind of work that we're doing. Nobody wants to write about it. Nobody wants to hear about it. They're corporate owned. So we have to be the ones that spread that news. Just like they did, like Gandhi did. He was also locked out of the media in India, had to create his own media. And just like the women did in Europe when they were trying to get the right to vote, they had to get up on a soapbox and spread the message themselves. That is what we had to do. And celebrate life to cultivate happiness. That's also very important. Let's not forget that. Thank you very much.